In April 2022, England introduced a mandatory calorie labeling requirement for large food away from home food outlets or out of home food outlets. The big idea behind the policy was that by showing the kilocalorie content of menu items, food businesses may reformulate their offerings and consumers may choose lower calorie options. Results from a study that asked the question, did the energy content of menu items actually change, were recently published in the British Medical Journal. In today's episode, researchers Jean Adams of the University of Cambridge and Mike Essman from Duke University's World Food Policy Center will discuss the study in detail, including its strengths, limitations, and implications, and then explore how it fits into the wider policy landscape around food labeling and public health. Welcome to the Leading Voices in Food podcast series. I'm Norbert Wilson, a professor of public policy at Duke University's Sanford School of Public Policy, where I'm also the director of the World Food Policy Center. Mike and Jean, thank you so much for taking time to join us today.
It's great to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Thanks so much for having us.
Now, everyone knows eating out is just part of life. For many, it's a place to make connections, can be a guilty pleasure, and sometimes it's just an outright necessity for busy folks, but it is also linked to poor dietary quality, weight gain, and even obesity. For policymakers, the challenge is identifying what policy changes can help improve population health. So, Jean, let's begin with you. Can you tell our listeners about the UK's menu labeling intervention and what change did you hope to see?
Yeah, so this was a policy that was actually a really long time in coming and came in and out of favour with a number of different governments. So maybe over the last 10 years, we've had various different suggestions to have voluntary and or mandatory calorie labelling in the out-of-home sector. Eventually, in April 2022, we did have new mandatory regulations that came into force that required large businesses, just in England, so not across the whole of the UK, just in England. If they sold food and non-alcoholic drinks, then they had to display the calories per portion of every item that they were selling. And then have alongside that somewhere on their menu a statement that said that adults need around 2,000 calories per day. So the policy applied just to large businesses, and the definition of that was that those businesses have 250 or more employees. But the employees didn't all have to be involved in serving food and drink. So this might apply also to a large hotel chain who just have some bars or something in their hotels. And the food and drinks covered were things that were available for immediate consumption, not prepackaged. And then there was also this proviso to allow high-end restaurants to be changing their menus regularly. So it was only for things that were on the menu for at least 30 days. So you mentioned that this policy or menu labeling might have at least two potential modes of impact. There's first this idea that providing calories or any sort of labeling on food can somehow provide information for consumers to make what we might hope would be better choices, might help them choose lower calorie options or healthier options. And then the second potential impact is that businesses might also use the information to change what sort of foods they're serving. So it might be that they didn't realize how many calories were in the food and they're suddenly embarrassed about it. Or as soon as their customers realize, they start to put a little bit of pressure on, we want something a little bit lower calorie. So there's this potential mechanism that operates at the demand side of how consumers might make choices, and another one at the supply side of what might be available to consumers. And we knew from previous evaluations of these sorts of interventions that there was some evidence that both could occur. Generally, it seems to be that findings from other places and countries are maybe null to small. So we were thinking that maybe we might see something similar in England.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that background. I do have a question about the length of time it took to get this menu labeling law in place. Before we get into the results, do you have a sense of why did it take so long? Was it industry pushback? Was it just change of governments? Do you have a sense of that?
Yeah, so I think it's probably a bit of both. To begin with, it was first proposed as a voluntary measure actually by industry. So we had this kind of big
Mm.
public-private partnership. What can industry do to support health? And that was one of the things they proposed. And then they didn't really do it very well. So there was this idea that everybody would do it. And in fact, we found maybe only about 20% of outlets did it. And then definitely we have had government churn in the UK over the last 5 years or so. So every new prime minister really came in and wanted to have their own obesity policy throughout the last one, started over. And every policy needs consulted on with the public and then with industry. And so that whole process just kind of got derailed over and over again.
Thank you. That is really helpful to understand that development of the policy and why it took time. Industry regulated policy can be a tricky one to actually see the results that we would hope. You've already given us a sort of insight into what you thought the results may be from previous studies, null to relatively small. So, Mike, I want to turn to you. Can you tell us what came out of the data?
Thank you. Yes. So we found a small overall drop in average calories offered per item. That amounts to a total of 9 calories per item reduction in our post-policy period relative to pre-policy. And this is about a 2% reduction. It was statistically significant, and we do in public health talk about how small effects can still have big impacts. So I do want to sort of put that out there, but also recognize that it was a small overall drop in calories. And then what we did is we looked at how different food groups changed and also how calories changed at different types of restaurants, whether it was fast food restaurants, sit downs that we call pubs, bars, and inns, and then also other different types of takeaways like cafes and things like that, where you might get a coffee or a cappuccino or something like that. What we found was driving the overall reduction in calories was a reduction in higher calorie items. So, as Jean mentioned at the outset, one of the things we were trying to identify in this analysis was whether we saw any evidence of reformulation. And we defined reformulation as whether specific products were reduced in their calories so that the same products were lower calories in the post period. We defined that as reformulation. And that would be different from, say, a change in menu offering where you might identify a high calorie item and take it off the menu so that then the overall calories offered goes down on average. So we found more evidence for the latter. Higher calorie items were removed. We separated into categories of removed items, items that were present in both periods, and new items added in the post period. There were higher calorie items in the removed group. The items that were present in both periods did not change. The new items were lower calorie items. What this says overall is this average reduction is driven by taking off high calorie items, adding some slightly lower calorie items, but we did not find evidence for reformulation, which is a crucial finding as well. We saw that the largest reductions occurred in burgers, beverages, and a rather large mixed group called mains. So burgers reduced by 103 calories per item. So that's pretty substantial. One of the reasons that's so large is that burgers, particularly if they're offered at a pub and might even come with fries or chips, as they say in the UK, and because they have such a high baseline calorie level, there's more opportunity to reduce. So whether it's making it slightly smaller patty or reducing the cheese or something like that, that's where we saw larger reductions among the burgers. With beverages, typically this involved the addition of lower calorie options, which is important if it gives an opportunity for lower calorie selections, and that was the main driver of reduction there. And then also we saw in mains a reduction of 30 calories per item. A couple of the other things we wanted to identify is whether there was a change in the number of items that were considered over England's recommended calories per meal. The recommended calories per meal is 600 calories or less for lunch and dinner, and we saw no statistical change in that group. So overall, we do see a slight reduction in average calories, but this study did not examine changes in consumer behavior. I do want to just briefly touch on that because this was part of a larger evaluation. So another study that was published using customer surveys that was published in Nature Human Behavior found no change in the average calories purchased or consumed after the policy. So this evaluation was looking at both the supply and the demand side changes as a result of this policy.
Thanks, Mike. And I've got lots of questions to follow up, but I'll try to control myself. The first one I'm interested to understand is you talk about the importance of the really calorie heavy items being removed and the introduction of newer, lower calorie items. And you said that this is not a study of the demand, but I'm interested to know, do you have a sense that the higher calorie items may not have been high or top sellers? It could be easy for a restaurant to get rid of those. Do you have any sense of, the types of items that were removed and of the consumer demand for those items?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, given that the largest changes were occurring among burgers, we're sort of doing this triangulation attempt to examine all the different potential impacts we can with the study tools we have. We did not see those changes reflected in consumer purchases, so I think sticking with the evidence, the best thing we could say is that the most frequently purchased items were not the ones that were being pulled off of menus. I think that would be the closest to the evidence. Now, no study is perfect. And we did in that customer survey examine the purchases and consumption of about 3,000 individuals before and after the policy. So it's relatively large, but certainly not fully comprehensive. But based on what we were able to find, it would seem that those reductions in large calorie items, it's probably fair to say were sort of the marginal choices. So we see some reduction in calories at the margins. That's why the overall is down, but we don't see at the most commonly sold. I should also mention in response to that, a lot of times when we think about eating out of home, we often think about fast food. We did not see reductions in fast food chains at all, essentially. And so, really, the largest reductions we found were in what would be considered more sit down dining establishments. So, for
Mhm.
example, sit down restaurants or even pubs, bars, and inns was one of our other categories. We did see average reductions in those chains. So the areas you kind of think about for people grabbing food quickly on the go, we did not see reductions there. And we think some of this is a function of the data itself, which is pubs, bars, and inns, because they offer larger plates, there's a little bit more space for them to reduce. And so those are where we saw the reductions. But in what we might typically think is sort of the grab and go type of food, we did not see reductions in those items. And so when we did our customer surveys, we saw that those did not lead to reductions in calories consumed.
I see this, and thank you for this. It sounds like the portfolio adjusted, getting rid of those heavy calorie items, adding more of the lower calorie items that may not have actually changed what consumers actually eat, because the ones that they typically eat didn't change at all. And I would imagine from what you've said that large global brands may not have made many changes, but more local brands have more flexibility, is my assumption of that. So that's really helpful to see. As you all looked at the literature, you had the knowledge that previous studies have found relatively small changes. Could you tell us about what this work looks like globally? There are other countries that have tried policies similar to this. What did you learn from those other countries about menu labeling?
Well, I mean, I'm tempted to say that we maybe should have learned that this wasn't the sort of policy that we could expect to make a big change. To me, one of the really attractive features of a labeling policy is it kind of reflects back those two mechanisms we've talked about, information and reformulation or changing menus, because we can talk about it in those two different ways of changing the environment and also helping consumers make better choices. Then it can be very attractive across the political landscape. And I suspect that that is one of the things that the UK or England learned. And that's reflected in the fact that it took a little while to get it over the line, but that lots of different governments came back to that it's attractive to people thinking about food and thinking about how we can support people to eat better in kind of a range of different ways. I think what we learned, like putting the literature all together, is this sort of policy might have some small effects. it's not going to be the thing that kind of changes the dial on diet-related diseases, but that it might well be part of an integrated strategy of many different tools together. I think we can also learn from the literature on labeling in the grocery sector, where there's been much more exploration of different types of labeling, whether colors work, whether black stop signs are more effective. And that leads us to conclusions that these more interpretive labels can lead to bigger impacts on consumer choices than just a number, right? A number is quite difficult to make some sense of. And I think that there are some ways that we could think about optimizing the policy in England before kind of writing it off as not effective.
Thank you. I think what you're saying is it worked, but it works maybe in the context of other policies. Is that a fair assessment?
Well, I mean, the summary of our findings, Mike's touched on quite a lot of it. We found that there was an increase in outlets adhering to the policy. That went from about 20% offered any labelling to about 80%. So there were still some places that were not doing what they were expected to do. But there was big changes in actual labelling practice. People also told us that they noticed the labels more, and they said that they used them much more than they previously. Like, there was some labeling before. We had saw big increases in noticing and using, but we found there's no change in calories purchased or calories consumed, which leads to kind of interesting questions. Okay, so what were they doing with it when they were using it? And maybe some people were using it to help them make lower calorie choices, but other people were trying to optimize calories for money spent. We saw these very small changes in the mean calorie of items available that Mike's described in lots of detail. And then we also did some work kind of exploring with restaurants, people who worked in the restaurant chains, and also people responsible for enforcement, kind of exploring their experiences with the policy. And one of the big conclusions from that was that local government were tasked with enforcement, but they weren't provided with any additional resources to make that happen. And for various reasons, it essentially didn't happen. And we've seen that with a number of different policies. In the food space in the UK, that there's this kind of presumption of compliance. Most people are doing it all right. We're not doing it 100%, and that's probably because it's not being checked. And there's no sanction for not following the letter of the law. So one of the reasons that local authorities are not doing enforcement, apart from that they don't have resources or additional resources for it, is that they have lots of other things to do in the food space, and they see those things as like higher risk and so more important to do. And so one of those things is inspecting for hygiene, making sure that the going out is not poisonous or adulterated or anything like that. And you can absolutely understand that these things that might cause acute sickness or even death in the case of allergies are much more important for them to be keeping an eye on than labeling. One of the other things that emerged through the process of implementation and during our evaluation was a big concern from communities with experience of eating disorders around kind of a greater focus on calorie counting. And lots of people recounting their experience that they just find that very difficult to be facing in a space where they're maybe not trying to think about their eating disorder or health, and then they're suddenly confronted with it. And when we've gone back and looked at the literature, there's just not very much literature on the impact of calorie labeling on people with eating disorders. And so we're a little bit uncertain still about whether that is a problem, but it's certainly perceived to be a problem, and lots of people find the policy difficult for that reason, because they know someone in their family or one of their friends with an eating disorder, and they're very alert to that potential harm.
I think this is a really important point to raise, that the law, the menu labeling, could have differential effects on different consumers. I'm not versed in this literature on the triggering effects of seeing menu labeling for people with disordered eating. But then I'm also thinking about a different group of consumers who are already struggling with obesity, and whether or not this policy is more effective for those individuals versus folks who are not. In the work that you all did you have any sense of, are there heterogeneous effects of the labeling? Did different consumers respond differentially to seeing the menu label, not just, for example, individuals maybe with disordered eating?
In this work, we mostly focused on compliance, customer responses in terms of consumption and purchases, changes in menus, and customers reporting whether or not they increased noticing and using. When we looked at the heterogeneous effects, some of these questions are what led us to propose a new project where we interviewed people and tried to understand their responses to calorie labeling. And there we get a lot of heterogeneous groups. So in those studies, and this work has not actually been published, but should be in the new year, we found that there's a wide range of different types of responses to the policy. For example, there may be some people who recently started going to the gym and maybe they're trying to actually bulk up. And so they'll actually choose higher calorie items. Conversely, there may be people who have a fitness routine or a dieting lifestyle that involves calorie tracking, and they might be using an app in order to enter the calories into that. And those people who are interested in calorie counting, they really loved the policy, they really wanted the policy, and it gave them a sense of control over their diet, and they felt comfortable and were really worried that if there was evidence that it wouldn't work, that would be taken away. And then you have a whole different group of people who are living with eating disorders who don't want to interact with those numbers when they are eating out of home. And they would rather eat socially and not have to think about those challenges. And so there's really vast diversity in terms of the responses to the policy. And that does present a challenge. And I think what it also does is cause us just to question what is the intended mechanism of action of this policy? Because when the policy was implemented, there's an idea of a relatively narrow set of effects. So if customers don't understand the number of calories that are in their items, you just provide them with the calories that are in those items. They will then make better choices as rational actors. But we know that eating out of home is far more complex. It's social. There's issues related to value for money. So maybe people want to make sure they're purchasing food that hasn't been so reduced in portions that now they don't get their value for money when they eat out. There's all sorts of body image related challenges when people may eat out. We didn't find a lot of evidence of this in our particular sample, but also in some of our consultation with the public in developing the interview, there's concern about judgment from peers when eating out. So it's a very sensitive topic. Some of the implications of that are we do probably need more communication strategies that can come alongside these policies and sort of explain the intended mechanism of impact to the public. We can't expect to simply add numbers to items and then expect that people are going to make the exact choices that are sort of in the best interest of public health. And that sort of brings us on to some potential alternative mechanisms of impact and other modes of labeling and those sorts of things.
Great. And Mike, this has been really helpful because you've also hinted at some of the ways that this policy, as implemented, could have been improved. And I wonder, do you have any other thoughts to add to how to make a policy like this have a bigger impact?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that was really helpful when Jean laid out her framing of the policy was there's multiple potential mechanisms of action. One of those is the potential reformulation in menu change. So we talked about those results. Another intended mechanism of action is through consumer choice. So if items have fewer calories on average, then that could reduce ultimately calories consumed. Or if people make choices of lower calorie items, that could also be a way to reduce the overall calories consumed. And so I would say this calorie labeling policy, it is a step in the direction of supportive structural interventions for helping people eat better because the calories were not previously available, so people did not know what they were eating. And so if you provide that, that fulfills the duty of transparency by businesses. When we spoke to people who worked in enforcement, they did support the policy simply on the basis of transparency because it's important for people to understand what they're consuming, and so that's sort of a generally acceptable principle. However, if we want to actually have stronger population health impact, then we do need to have stronger mechanisms of action. So one of the ways that can reduce calories consumed by the consumers, so the sort of demand side, would be some of the interpretive labels. G mentioned them earlier. There's now a growing body of evidence across, particularly in Latin America. I would say some of the strongest evidence began in Chile, but also in Mexico and in other Latin American countries, where they've put warning labels on items in order to reduce their consumption. These are typically related to packaged foods, is where most of the work has been done. But in order to reduce consumer demand, what it does is rather than expecting people to be sort of doing math problems on the fly as they go around and make their choices, you're actually just letting them know, well, by the way, this is an item that's very high in calories or saturated fat or sodium or sugars or some combination of those. And so what that does is you've already helped make that decision for the consumers. You've at least let them know this item has a high level of nutrients of concern, and so you can take that away. Conversely, if you have an item that's 487 calories, do you really know what you're going to do with that information? So that's one way to have stronger impact. The other way that that type of policy can have stronger impact is it sets clear thresholds for those warnings. And so when you have clear thresholds for warnings, you can have a stronger mechanism for reformulation. And so what companies may want to do is they may not want to display those warning labels, maybe because it's embarrassing, it makes their candy or whatever the unhealthy food look bad, sort of an eyesore, which is the point. And so what they'll do is they can reformulate those nutrients to lower levels so that they no longer qualify for that regulation. And so there are ways to essentially strengthen both of those mechanisms of action. Whereas when it's simply on the basis of transparency, then what that does is leave all of the decision making and work on the consumer.
Mike, this is great because I've worked with colleagues like Gabby Fretes and Sean Cash and others on some menu labeling out of Chile. And we're currently doing some work within the center on food nutrition labels to see how different consumers are responding. There's a lot more work to be done in this space. And of course, our colleagues at UNC have also been doing this work. So this work is really important because it tells us how it can help consumers make different choices and how it can affect how companies behave. My final question to the two of you is simply, what would you like policymakers to learn from this study? Or maybe not just this study alone, but this body of work. What should they take away?
Well, I think there's lots of information out there on how to do food labeling well, and we can certainly learn from that. And Mike's talks about the work from South America, particularly, where they're helping people identify the least healthy products, and they're also providing messaging around what you should do with that, like choose a product with fewer of these black symbols. But I think even if labeling is optimized, it's not really going to solve our problem of dietary related diseases. And I think I always want policymakers to know, and I think many of them do understand this, that there is no one magic solution. And we need to be thinking about labeling as part of a strategy that addresses marketing in its entirety, right? So companies are using all sorts of strategies to encourage us to buy products. We need to be thinking of all sorts of strategies to support people to buy different products and to eat better. And I think that focuses on things like rebalancing price, supporting people to afford healthier food, focusing advertising and price promotions on healthier products. And I also think we need to be looking even further upstream, though, right? That we need to be thinking about the incentives that are driving companies to make and sell less healthy products, because I don't think that they particularly want to be selling less healthy products or causing lots of illness. It's those products are helping them achieve their aims of creating profit and growth for their shareholders. And so I think we need to find creative ways to support companies to experiment with healthier products that either help them simultaneously achieve those demands of profit or growth, or somehow allow them to step away from those demands, either for a short period or for a longer period. I think that that requires us to kind of relook at how we do business and economics in our countries.
Mike?
Yeah, I think that was a really thorough answer by Gene, so I'll just add a couple points. I think most fundamentally, what we need to think about when we're doing policy making to improve diet is we need to always think about, are we helping to make the healthier choice the easier choice? And so what that means is we're not implementing policies that merely provide information that then require individuals to do the rest of the work. We need to have a food environment that includes healthier options that are easily accessible, but also affordable. That's one thing that's come through in quite a lot of the work we've done. There are a lot of concerns about the high cost of food. And so if people feel like the healthier choices are also affordable choices, that's one of many ways to support the easier choice. And I really just want to reiterate what Jean said in terms of the economics of unhealthy food. In many ways, these large multinational corporations are, from their perspective, doing right by their shareholders by producing a profitable product. Now, there are debates on whether or not that's a good thing, of course. There's quite a lot of evidence for the negative health impacts of ultra processed products, and those are getting a lot more attention these days, and that's a good thing. What we do need to think about is why is it that UPFs are so widely consumed? So, in many ways, they are optimized to be overconsumed, they're optimized to be highly profitable, because the ingredients that are involved in their production means that they can add a lot of salt, sugar, and fat. And what that does is lead to overconsumption. So we need to think about there's something fundamentally broken about this incentive structure that is incentivizing businesses to sell unhealthy food products with these food additives that lead to overconsumption, obesity, and the associated comorbidities. And if we can start to make a little progress and think creatively about how could we incentivize a different incentive structure, one where actually it would be in a food business's best interest to be much more innovative and bold and produce healthier products for everyone. That's something that I think we will have to contend with, because if we are thinking that we are only going to be able to restrict our way out of this, then that's very difficult, because people still need to have healthy alternatives. And so we can't merely think about restricting. We also have to think about how do we promote access to healthier foods.
Yeah, this is great insight. I appreciate the phrasing of making the healthy choice the easy choice. And I also heard a version of this, making the healthy choice the affordable choice. But it also seems like we need to find ways to make the healthy choice the profitable choice as well. So I'm thrilled that we had this opportunity to talk together about this paper and about the broader set of projects that you all are doing. I am going to go ahead and say, please come back so that we can talk about the paper on the interview with customers from restaurants. And I think this will be really important insight into furthering this work. So this is a great place to stop. I'd like to thank our two guests, Jean Adams from the University of Cambridge and Mike Essman, who is at the World Food Policy Center at Duke University. And I'd like to thank you, our listeners, for paying attention to this podcast. And also thank you to our producer, Deborah Hill. I'm Norbert Wilson.
Thank you for listening to the Leading Voices in Food podcast. This program is an educational series produced by Duke University's World Food Policy Center with the goal of promoting productive conversation for food systems change. If you would like to subscribe, you can find it on Apple Podcasts, YouTube Music, or your favorite podcast app. Transcripts are also available on the website of the Duke World Food Policy Center.